Let me tell you something. I don't think most folks have fully absorbed yet. Over the last few months, while the headlines have bounced from crisis to crisis, something extraordinary has been happening inside the Republican Party. Something even people in Washington didn't expect. And I want to walk you through it carefully. Because the story isn't just about politics or strategy or campaigns. It's about a moment when old alliances crack, when promises collide with reality, and when a party built around a single personality suddenly realizes that personality is not invincible. And it all begins with the Epstein Files. Now, I've been in enough meetings, enough situation rooms, enough late-night phone calls to know when an issue is about justice and when it's about power. And what's happening around Donald Trump right now isn't just a legal fight. It's a loyalty test. It's the moment where his own people, his most outspoken allies, his loudest defenders, his true believers finally looked at him and said, hold on, this doesn't add up, and I'm telling you that shift is bigger than most people realize. When Trump came back into office, he and his attorney general, Pam Bondi, carried with them a very specific promise. They would reveal everything about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. They would expose the networks, the contacts, the financiers, the powerful men who circled around that man like moths around a flame. And for millions of Americans, especially those who spent years believing there was a hidden list of elites who needed to be brought to justice, that promise felt like a reckoning long overdue. But, promises are easy when you're campaigning. They're easy when you're standing in front of cheering crowds. Governing forces you to confront the truth. And the truth has a way of pushing back, because once Trump settled into the Oval Office again, once the weight of responsibility landed on his desk, he learned what every president learns. Information isn't tidy. Files don't bend themselves into narratives that help your political brand. Real evidence doesn't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And when you claim you're going to release every piece of information about a case as complicated, as ugly, as interconnected as Epstein, sooner or later, you run into the reality that some of those documents don't make your friends look good. Some of them might not make you look good either. That's where the story shifts. Because as soon as Trump began pulling back, calling the entire thing boring, referring to the scandal as the Epstein hoax, telling his own supporters they were wasting their time obsessing over it, well, that's when the foundation under him started to crack. When you tell a group of people who spent years believing in your crusade for truth that the truth no longer matters, those people don't just walk away quietly. They start to ask questions. And some of the loudest questions came from inside his own party. I watched it happen with a kind of stunned fascination, because these weren't the usual moderates or institutional conservatives. These weren't never Trump Republicans or old Bush-era figures shaking their heads from afar. No, these were the people who were supposed to be in his corner no matter what. Folks like Thomas Massie, a congressman who spent years criticizing Democrats for hiding the truth about Epstein, suddenly pointing that same accusation back at his own party leader. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't dodging. He said openly that the administration's selective disclosures looked less like transparency and more like a smokescreen. And then you had Marjorie Taylor Greene, yes. That Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had once branded herself the female version of Trump, who attacked anyone who dared question him, now standing on the steps of the Capitol demanding that the entire set of Epstein files be released without redaction, without excuses, without political games. That would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. That would have been unthinkable last year. But the moment the base realized that Trump was stepping back from the very issue he had used to define righteousness, betrayal, and corruption, well, something in that coalition broke. I've seen this pattern before. When leaders build movements around grievance, around suspicion, around the idea that they're hiding something from you. That energy is powerful. It motivates people, but it's also volatile because eventually the spotlight turns. And when supporters who've been taught to distrust everyone suddenly sense inconsistency from the person they trusted most, they don't shrug it off. They revolt. That's how you ended up with Lauren Boebert, Nancy Mace, and several others joining a discharge petition to force Congress to vote on releasing the files. I want you to understand how rare that is. Congress is built on hierarchy. You don't embarrass party leadership unless you're willing to pay the price. Yet here they were, Republicans defying Trump, defying their speaker, defying their donors, all because they believed he had failed them on the one issue they cared most about. And then something even more remarkable happened. In the Senate, where unity is almost sacred in the GOP, two conservative figures, Josh Hawley and Rand Paul, broke ranks. They voted with Democrats to force the release of the files. Now, I've worked with both of those senators. They're not people who cross party lines lightly, but they understood what was at stake. They saw that the credibility of their movement, of their voters, of everything they claimed to represent was on the line, and they chose transparency over loyalty to one man. When that vote came in 51-49 and Trump found himself on the wrong side of his own party, I realized we were watching something historic. You cannot overstate how significant that moment was. This wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about spending or foreign policy. It wasn't even about the usual culture war battles. This was the Republican Party taking a stand on an issue that Trump had long used to unify them and choosing to break with him instead. People ask me all the time, why did this happen? Why now? Well, let me tell you why. Because the Epstein scandal struck at something deeper than politics. It tapped into a fundamental belief that no matter how broken the system is, there should be justice for the vulnerable. It touched something primal and moral in the base of the GOP. When you talk about elites abusing young girls, that's not left or right. That's human. That's morale outrage. And when a politician promises justice but then pulls away the moment it becomes inconvenient, people notice. Even Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, a man who has been more loyal to Trump than almost anyone in Washington, eventually had to come out and say he supported releasing everything. Now, don't misunderstand. He didn't say it because it was safe. He said it because the political cost of resisting transparency had become unbearable. That's how revolutions inside parties begin. Not with explosions, not with dramatic speeches, but with quiet fractures that widen until they can't be ignored. And I'll tell you, the moment I knew the ground had shifted, when Trump, frustrated with the criticism, frustrated with the pressure from his own allies, lashed out and told the MAGA base to move on. That phrase might as well have been a spark in a room full of gasoline. Because those words didn't sound like strength. They sounded like fear. Fear that releasing the full files would reveal something uncomfortable. Fear that the narrative was slipping out of his hands. Fear that, for the first time, his own people were questioning him in ways he couldn't control. And fear, when it shows up in a leader who has built his image on dominance, is contagious. What came next was predictable, if you've studied political movements, but shocking if you believed his grip on the GOP was absolute. Right-wing influencers, some of whom had built entire careers defending. Trump turned their criticism toward him. Online communities that once treated him as infallible began to ask why the documents hadn't been released. And polls, yes, those polls Republicans used to dismiss, began showing a stunning trend. Trump's handling of the Epstein issue was his single most damaging weakness among conservative voters. That's not my measurement. That's not the media's. That's what Republican consultants were whispering behind closed doors. You could almost feel the panic in the hallways of Capitol Hill. The same lawmakers who used to fear crossing him suddenly feared something else, being seen as complicit in a cover-up. And the irony of all this, it didn't have to happen. If Trump had honored his promise, if he had simply allowed transparency from the start, his party would still be unified behind him. But the moment he hesitated, the moment he tried to control which pieces were shown and which were hidden, he crossed the one line his movement could not accept. Because when you build your political brand on the idea that other people are corrupt, that other people are hiding the truth, that other people are protecting elites, well, your supporters hold you to that same standard. You don't get exemptions. You don't get grace. You don't get to walk away from the fight. You started, and so here we are living through something unprecedented. Trump, a man whose authority over the GOP once felt unbreakable, now facing open revolt from the very people who helped build his power, all because of a scandal that refuses to stay buried. And trust me, this is only the beginning. When I left off, I told you that what we were watching wasn't a small disagreement or a passing skirmish. It was the beginning of a political rupture, one that even seasoned analysts didn't predict. And as I kept following the situation, day after day, it became obvious that the fallout was spreading faster than anyone inside the Republican Party could contain. Because once a breach of trust begins, once supporters start to doubt, once lawmakers realize that loyalty is no longer guaranteed, everything that was once stable becomes unpredictable. And that's exactly what happened as the Epstein Files controversy grew deeper, darker, and far more destabilizing for Donald Trump than anyone expected. The story turned when the second wave of documents dropped, not the flashy binder the White House handed out to influencers earlier in the year, filled with publicly available material and little of substance. No, I'm talking about the trove released by House Democrats' emails, photos of handwritten notes, social calendars, personal correspondence, drafts of legal memos, documents that didn't paint a complete picture, but painted enough of one to raise questions that wouldn't go away. One email in particular where Jeffrey Epstein claimed that Trump knew about the girls ignited a firestorm. Now, I'm going to be fair here. Anyone who has spent time in public life knows that people say a lot of things in private emails. They exaggerate, they lie, they flatter themselves, but it didn't matter whether Epstein's words were accurate or fabricated. What mattered was that they existed, and for a Republican base primed for years to believe that anybody connected to Epstein might be implicated, that one line hit like a grenade. When that email went public, the first reaction from the White House was denial. Trump called it fake. Said the handwriting wasn't his. Said the entire thing was part of a smear campaign. But the problem wasn't the denial. The problem was that the denial contradicted the narrative. He'd spent years building that he was the one who would expose the truth, that he was the fearless crusader against corruption, that he alone had the courage to shine a light on the darkest corners of the American elite, and they reacted accordingly. I remember the moment it became clear this wasn't going to fade. It was a late evening, and I was watching a conservative live stream, one of the big ones, hosted by a broadcaster who used to defend Trump at every turn. His chat, usually overflowing with praise for the former president, was suddenly filled with angry comments, people saying they felt misled, people saying they felt deceived, people saying We supported him because he promised transparency. If he doesn't release the files, he's just like everyone else. Now, that might sound like online chatter to some folks, but I've run national campaigns. I understand how shifts in sentiment begin. They never start in the boardrooms of political consultants. They start in places like that chat window, thousands of people typing in unison, forming a consensus. Neither party leadership nor the candidate can control. And while all that was happening, something even more damaging was unfolding inside Congress. Because the Republicans who had signed the discharge petition demanding a full vote to release the documents weren't backing down. In fact, they were doubling down. And they began to notice something remarkable. The more they challenged Trump, the more support they got from their constituents. Their phones weren't ringing with threats. They were ringing with encouragement for Marjorie Taylor Greene. It was a turning point. She had spent years standing shoulder to shoulder with Trump, defending him, even when other Republicans stepped away. But on this issue, she didn't just diverge from him, she went to war. And you could feel the personal nature of it. She felt humiliated that she had defended him so vigorously, only to find that he wasn't willing to uphold the very standards he demanded of others. And when Trump retaliated by calling her wacky and pushing her out of his inner circle, it didn't weaken her position. It strengthened it. It signaled that the old rules, where Trump could insult a Republican and the party would close ranks behind him, no longer applied. In politics, that's the kind of moment you can't walk back. Meanwhile, over in the Senate, Josh Hawley gave an interview that surprised me. He said, if you promise transparency, you deliver transparency. It doesn't matter who it implicates. For a senator who had spent years aligning himself with Trump's populist vision, that kind of statement wasn't just a critique, it was a warning shot. Rand Paul, who has always been more independent-minded, took it further. He didn't just support releasing the files. He questioned why the administration was refusing. And when a libertarian like Paul starts raising concerns about selective transparency, a lot of Republican voters, listen, they trust him to call out government overreach, no matter who is in charge. That's why the vote happened. That's why it was 51-49. And that's why the reaction was so intense. But the real turning point, the moment that sealed Trump's political vulnerability, came from someone no one expected, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House. Now, I've known speakers, I've worked with them, I've disagreed with them, negotiated with them, fought with them, and I'll tell you this, a speaker does not oppose his president lightly, especially when the president is the unquestioned leader of the party. So when Johnson stepped to a podium and said he supported releasing all the Epstein documents, including the testimony of Ghislaine Maxwell, that wasn't a statement of principle. That was a survival instinct. He could feel the pressure from his members. He could sense the tidal wave of skepticism building among the base, and he didn't want to be the man who stood between the Republican Party and its sudden demand for transparency. At that moment, you could almost hear the internal gears of the GOP shifting. It wasn't just a few rogue lawmakers anymore. It wasn't just online influencers or fringe voices. It was the Speaker of the House, one of the few positions in American politics with enough authority to challenge a sitting president. And he was openly breaking from Trump. That's when the cracks stopped being cracks and became something much closer to a collapse. But the situation escalated further when a fresh batch of documents leaked. These weren't public releases. These were unauthorized dumps, photographs of deposition transcripts, lawyer emails discussing sealed exhibits, handwritten notes from security personnel. None of them proved criminal behavior on Trump's part, but they added ambiguity, and ambiguity is poison in a political climate built on distrust. You could feel the panic from the West Wing. Statement came out quickly, angrily, accusing Democrats of hacking, accusing Republicans of sabotage, accusing the media of fabricating context. But when a president starts firing in every direction, it doesn't project confidence, it projects desperation. And that desperation was noticed behind closed doors. Republican strategists were starting to map out contingency plans. What if Trump couldn't hold the base? What if the party needed to distance itself before the scandal overshadowed the election? What if donors started asking uncomfortable questions about the potential fallout? I don't need leaked memos to read between those lines. I've lived through moments where supporters start looking around, asking themselves whether the leader they once trusted still has control of the story. The truth is this: the Epstein Files controversy hit Trump in the one place he never expected to feel pain. His own base's belief that he was on their side, fighting their fight, lifting their banner, because when your whole movement is built on the claim that you're exposing hidden corruption, you can't afford to look like you're hiding something yourself. And the more Trump resisted full transparency, the more he insisted that people move on. The more Republicans began to whisper something they had never dared say before. What if he's not telling us everything? Now, I don't know what's in every sealed file. I don't claim to know whether some of the allegations are true, false, distorted, or misunderstood, but I do know this: the perception that Trump might be hiding something has become more damaging than any single document could ever be. Perception in politics is reality, and that perception grew stronger when Trump made the unforced error of attacking the very lawmakers who had once defended him. He mocked Massie. He dismissed Thomas Massie. He hinted that Josh Hawley was grandstanding. These weren't strategic moves. These were reactions driven by frustration, by fear, by the realization that control was slipping. And that's what this whole story is really about. Control over a narrative that Trump once wielded like a weapon. Control over a base that once followed him, unquestioningly. Control over a party that once shaped itself entirely around his will. But as the Epstein scandal spiraled, that control weakened. And Republican leaders who had once built their careers on his coattails started to see something they hadn't seen before: a political future where their loyalty to him was not an asset, but a liability. When fear moves from the base to the top of the party, the structure changes. And by the end of the second wave of documents, the GOP wasn't just divided, it was realigning itself not around Trump, but around the idea that maybe, just maybe, the movement he led had outgrown him. By the time the third wave of disclosures hit Washington, the atmosphere had shifted from unease to full-blown dread. You could feel it in the television studios, in the hallways of Congress, in the whispers leaking out of conservative think tanks. You could feel it in the White House briefing room, where the tone of the administration's responses grew increasingly sharp, brittle, even frantic, and it was becoming clear to almost everyone paying attention that the controversy surrounding the Epstein Files had transformed from a political headache into a structural threat, not just to Donald Trump, but to the very coalition that had propelled him to power. And the truth, the uncomfortable truth for Republicans, was that the damage wasn't coming from Democrats. It wasn't coming from the media. It wasn't coming from the so-called deep state. It was coming from the inside, from people who had once marched behind Trump with unwavering loyalty, from lawmakers who had built their identities on defending him, from influencers who had carved entire careers out of amplifying his message. They weren't just stepping back anymore, they were walking away. Some were even turning around, and that realization that the rebellion was internal was the real earthquake. Now, I've been through my share of political crises. I've weathered scandals, faced hostile Congresses, dealt with misinformation, and navigated the chaos of a polarized nation. But even in my toughest moments, I never experienced what Trump experienced in that period. The slow motion collapse of a movement built on personal loyalty, and I'll tell you why. Because loyalty that's built on grievance, on anger, on suspicion, on the promise of exposing enemies, is loyal only for as long as the grievance is aimed outward. The moment the spotlight turns inward, everything unravels. That's why the party's reaction to the third set of files was so explosive. The documents weren't even the most damaging ones. In fact, many of them were procedural memos, legal discussions, partial de position drafts. They didn't contain smoking guns. They didn't contain dramatic new revelations. But they contained enough ambiguity, enough gaps, enough half-visible lines of inquiry to make one thing painfully clear. Trump had known for months information he hadn't shared with his base, not because the evidence exonerated him, but because the evidence was messy, complicated, and politically dangerous, and the base reacted the way you would expect a crowd that feels betrayed to react. They demanded more. One prominent conservative host, someone who had spent years championing Trump, summed it up bluntly. He said, if the president wants to clear his name, he should release the entire archive. All of it, no exceptions. This was a man who once ended every show with, "We stand with Trump." Now, he was questioning whether Trump was standing with them. That shift wasn't just symbolic, it was catalytic, because the Republican lawmakers who had been hesitating, who had been weighing whether to confront Trump or stay in line, suddenly had cover. They had grassroots support. They had donors calling them not to defend Trump, but to ask why the administration was blocking transparency. And when money starts asking questions, political courage suddenly becomes easier to find. Then there were the closed-door meetings where Republican strategists walked their members through polling numbers that had been held tightly under lock and key. Numbers showing that Trump's refusal to release the files was not just unpopular, it was toxic among voters who once supported him most fiercely. Voters who believed he had entered office to expose the corrupt elite now felt he was protecting them instead. And that's where things became irreversible, because every successful political movement has a narrative, a story. It tells its followers about who they are, what they fight for, and what makes their leader different. And Trump's narrative had always been simple. I tell you the truth, they hide from you. So when the Epstein Files scandal transformed that promise into a question, what truth is he hiding from you? The entire foundation of his movement began to shake. That's when you saw the panic in the White House. That's when the accusations flew in every direction. That's when press briefings turned hostile, defensive, even erratic. Nobody inside that building would admit it. But observers could see the shift, and so could Republicans in Congress. Fissures became fractures. Fractures became factions. And factions became something Trump had never faced before. Organized resistance. It started with small groups of Republican lawmakers meeting quietly, comparing notes, strategizing about how to move forward without appearing to directly challenge the president. But that caution evaporated when the speaker himself, Mike Johnson, began signaling publicly that the files must be released in full. When a speaker breaks ranks, the whole party feels it. Johnson wasn't acting out of moral outrage. He was acting out of survival because he had the same polling. Republicans were looking at polling that showed a rising tide of distrust toward Trump among voters who still considered themselves conservatives. He saw where the wind was blowing, and he knew he had two choices: tie the fate of the House to Trump, or anchor himself to the principle of transparency. He chose transparency, and that decision reshaped everything. By the end of that hearing, it was clear to everyone watching this was no longer a partisan issue. This was a crisis of leadership. The first hearings they scheduled were not designed to attack Democrats. They were designed to demand answers from Trump's own Justice Department. Questions like, why were certain documents withheld? Why were certain testimonies delayed? Why were redactions expanding rather than shrinking? And when Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, appeared before those committees, she faced not praise, but aggressive questioning from Republicans who once celebrated her appointment. The moment that stood out most to me came when Thomas Massie leaned forward and asked, if the administration has nothing to hide, why not release everything? It was a question loaded with implications. It was a question that carried the weight of the movement behind it, and it was asked not by a Democrat, not by a critic, but by a man who had once championed Trump's agenda. Bondi's answers were cautious, legalistic, evasive. She spoke about protecting victims. She spoke about due process. But the committee wasn't interested in abstractions. They wanted clarity. And the more she hedged, the more it fueled the suspicion that something was being concealed. And the White House knew it. I've seen how pressure affects presidents. Some respond with calm determination. Others lash out. Trump chose the latter. He took to social media, attacking the very Republicans who had once defended him, calling them disloyal, calling them traitors, claiming they were working with Democrats to undermine him. That kind of rhetoric might have worked in the past. But in this moment, it only deepened the rupture. Because now even the base wasn't buying it. Conservative forums were filled with people saying, why won't he release the files? Questions that once would have been shut down were now multiplying. You could feel the shift. A leader who once commanded absolute devotion was suddenly defending himself against his own supporters. And then came the final blow. The fourth trove of documents, the one that Republicans themselves released, was designed to show that Democrats had selectively edited earlier disclosures, but unintentionally, it did something far more damaging. It proved that the White House had been sitting on a much larger archive than the president had admitted. It didn't matter whether the content was incriminating or not. What mattered was the lie. What mattered was the cover-up. What mattered was the realization by the base, the people who had believed in him the most, that Trump had not only broken his promise of transparency, but had actively worked to shape the narrative, to control the narrative, to withhold information. And once that truth surfaced, you could almost feel the sound, the quiet, unmistakable cracking of a movement's spine. From that moment forward, Republicans were no longer asking whether they should break with Trump. They were asking whether they had already broken with him. And I'll tell you something that I've learned over many years in public life. Once a political party starts imagining its future without its leader, the leader's power is already gone. That's the moment Trump found himself in, a moment defined by a simple, devastating fact. His own party had turned the page, not because Democrats forced them, not because the media pressured them, but because the Epstein Files controversy revealed something deeper, something fatal to his movement. The myth of his infallibility. In the end, the scandal wasn't about documents or emails or depositions. It was about trust And when trust collapses, nothing else holds. That's the story most people don't realize. That's the story unfolding behind the headlines. And that's the story that will shape the next chapter, not just for Donald Trump, but for the Republican Party itself